Spring is here. But old man winter's coming back on Thursday. But spring is also coming back here in the church, as evident by Pope Francis' first papal encyclical entitled The Joy of the Gospel. If you look at those handouts, the emphasis is on joy. Can I say there's a joy to be a person in this world? Not because of the sadness and all the suffering going on. It's a joy to proclaim the gospel. And that's what maybe personifies this wonderful man from Buenos Aires, Argentina, with his own attitude on life and the life of the church. Look at that. I'd like to go over this glossary of terms to explain the idea of papacy. What is this all about? Who is this pope? And that matter, all the other popes in the past and subsequently in the present and in the future. I'd like to explain the first term, magisterium. Known as the teaching authority of the Roman Catholic Church. It's the tradition of the church the last 2,000 years. It's the authority of the church to teach religious doctrine. Number two is very important for us to understand because there's no dichotomy between the hierarchy and the laity. Number two, the sense is for them, the sense of the faithful, from the bishops to the faithful, that they manifest a universal consent in matters of faith and morals. A universal consent in matters of faith and morals. Collegiality of the local conference of bishops throughout the world. It is a global church. It is the only faith tradition that's centralized throughout the world, but it's divided in all these different conferences. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, came from the Latin American Conference of Bishops, which includes of all of South America, Caribbean, including Puerto Rico. The bishops have a threefold office of teaching, sanctifying, and governing, always part of the universal church, particularly concerned to the local church. We'll talk about that later on. Why is this important since Vatican II even now? New term on the new evangelization. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, personifies. He practiced even as a Jesuit. By the way, he was a Jesuit. He only became Franciscan recently, thank God. But he's a trained Jesuit. The idea is to teach, to preach, counsel in new innovative ways the message of Jesus Christ in the church and throughout the world, with a special outreach to disaffected Catholics. Here in this country, the largest faith tradition in this country are Roman Catholics. You know what the second group is? Former Catholics. They're up. There's a lot of disaffection. Just two brief witnesses of our colleagues who are personal friends of the Holy Father. The first is the Archbishop Roberto Gonzalez. Roberto and I worked together for 5 years in the South Bronx when I was a young priest. We were talking about poverty and tension. We dealt with the crack issue, AIDS, and other stuff. And him and I, one night, nearly got killed by a drug dealer. He's now the Archbishop of San Juan. For 15 years, he sat next to the Holy Father in the Latin American conferences. They're both personal friends. And what he told me when I asked him the other day, what the message for the first year is, the Holy Father truly cares about people, especially poor people. The second person was my supervisor for 2 years at the Washington Theological Union, Sean Cardinal O'Malley. He was at Capuchin College down there, and when I was a student at Washington Theological, he was my advisor, and he was a tough guy, but a very humble man. And he was a member of the group of 8 cardinals in the Holy Father's Special Advisory Board. Buenos Aires, Argentina, at the time during the late 70s and 80s, had a lot of political tension and unrest. The group they called desaparecidos, that disappeared. Many people who went against the government disappeared. They never found their bodies and matters like that. Sean O'Malley, my advisor, told me years ago that this wonderful man, this Father Bergoglio, the provincial of the Jesuits, saved many people who were on the list to be killed, to be disappeared. And he hid them away over towards the rural areas. This is the present Pope, who saved many people's lives. Sean also advocated when he was the head of the Capilla Latina against any type of atrocity going on in that matter. So they're personal friends for 30 years, and they said he's a very fine man. Enough said. I will pass on to my colleague, Dr. Egler.
So, less than a year ago, because I have to be technical, 364 days ago, actually, the first Latin American Pope appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, who chose the name Francis in honor of a saint very near and dear to most of us here, St. Francis of Assisi. And I think that appearance really set the tone for what we've seen happen in the last year. he greets the crowd in a very unpapal-like manner, really kind of just saying good evening to everybody. And the first thing after that is he asks everybody gathered, everybody watching on TV, to please pray for him. So he requests prayer before he starts to offer any sort of blessing. And I think in a way that kind of gave us an indication what was going to happen over this last year. 1 year into his pontificate, he remains very popular, and I'll focus on American Catholics, and he's seen as a force for positive change within the Roman Catholic Church. More than 8 in 10 U.S. Catholics say they have a very favorable view of the pontiff, and then over half of that are very, very favorable. So what we can determine so far, and what we've learned through his very interesting media presence, as we see, but he's a very quiet and humble man. And as a Latin American, he was a leader of 51 million Catholics, the largest concentration of Catholics on the planet. But he's really not very business as usual in terms of what popes have been doing. And I think that's really interesting because neither was the saint whose name he took. Francis of Assisi was a Christian who reached out to Muslims, to others. Francis was the one who listened to everyone, every creature, and was tried to be in dialogue with everyone and everything. And I think we're starting to see that with this particular pope. So Francis is a listener, and it appears to be the case that with his listening, he's trying to move towards reconciliation, healing, as well as development within the church. So a year later, what do we see him doing? Well, he's kind of checked out. He actually decided to leave the Vatican with the Roman Curia, again in a very unprecedented move, as many of his moves seem to have been over the last year. And he took this annual retreat that the Roman Curia normally do in St. Peter's in the Vatican. He took it off-site because he feels it's really important for all of us, if we can, to get away for 5 days. Like, doesn't that sound wonderful? Just be quiet for 5 days. So I think, just like Francis of Assisi felt it was very important to get away, and he would often climb the hills in Umbria to be away from everyone, to be in solitude. Pope Francis is participating in this tradition of, a very important tradition of attending to his spiritual side, something he feels is a priority in order to make this church work and continue to grow. In that sense, he's really not doing anything that any of his predecessors haven't done. And I think I think Father Brian's going to talk about a little later, contrasting him with Pope Benedict XVI. But what do I see as his agenda, or what has been happening? If we have to narrow it down, I think he's got 3 priorities: the poor, the marginalized, and those who have left the church. So he's very qualified in terms of understanding the predicaments of these people. Again, many of his predecessors did share this same quality. John the 23rd and John Paul II, both of whom are going to be canonized by both Pope Francis and Pope Benedict on April 27th, were very instrumental in moving towards this. He's the only pope in the modern era who lived and worked amongst slum dwellers. He sees himself as a sinner, and not in like this really old school Catholic way of beating up on himself. It's just a figure of speech to sort of set the tone for his reformation of the church. He's inherited a church with a lot of crisis and a lot of scandal, but I think what's been interesting is he's watched and listened this past year, just like anyone does in their first year on the job. And I think what's really going to be interesting is what unfolds, especially with his continued emphasis on this focus on the poor and the marginalized. Thanks.
Well, this is one of the problems of hitting cleanup after two very fine presentations. I do want to add, I think she's left now, but I want to thank Professor Horowitz for giving us this forum I thank you for being here. And I have one correction, and I can tell her later. I didn't start this series. It was Professor Hughes who started this. And even before him, it was the chairman of the history department named Flynn that started it before Professor Hughes. So the tradition continues, and I'm so glad that Professor Horowitz, has decided that she would continue it in her own time. So I think a lot of the highlights of one of the things I wanted to say have been already covered. I just want to maybe summarize a few things in my own assessment, of his 12 months in office. He's clearly captured the imagination of the world. I think he's brought a new visibility to the papacy. He does that very cleverly. He's very accessible, a lot of interviews. And of course, his recent exhortation against trickle-down economics, I think, has really brought a new visibility to the church, especially, again, from people that seem a little bit uneasy about that. I think he clearly understands the power of the media. I think you've seen that. He understands the power of images. And again, images can convey nonverbal communication. And that allows him to speak in gestures and in symbols. And things like you've seen, washing the feet, of non-Catholic women who happen to be Muslims. Very powerful. In the Vatican, kissing the head of a deformed man. His simple style of dress, as Professor Egler said, his refusal to live in the Vatican palace, living more humbly, as he did in South America. So he projects this theme of joy, again, which Professor Egler talked about, humility, mercy, humanity, which is very important, I think, for us to relate to. He seems very inviting, and I think, all of us, most of us being Catholic laity, see that a lot of times we see the church in terms of hierarchy, and he, again, seems to be, more like, one of us. And when was the last time you heard somebody say, the Pope was somebody that was cool? You don't get that too often. Or when was the last time a Pope was the subject of a new magazine with a new centerfold as part of that magazine? I have no idea what that centerfold will be, but they promised that. So again, in these symbols and pronouncements, Francis has sent a very powerful message, I think, about his priorities, as has been mentioned, his concern for the poor and for the marginalized, his emphasis on social justice concerns, and less emphasis, I don't want to say abdication, but less emphasis, more of a balance, again, as social justice as opposed to hot button issues, again, which has so divided the church and many Catholics, again. And not just abortion, I'm talking about things like contraception, which is, very, very much of an issue for married Catholics. So again, I think balance is a theme there. He clearly wants to make a difference in the world. That remains to be seen. Some people say too much of a difference, but that remains to be seen. And then the other thing I'll reemphasize here is that the tone of the papacy, has really changed, and I think for the better. That's not to, diminish Pope Benedict, but they're two different people. He comes off as less strident. He's less legalistic, doctrinaire. Again, he's warm. He's compassionate. He's inviting. A cautionary note here, I think, and I think this has been alluded to, that he may have changed the tone of the church, but he's not asked for a fundamental change in doctrine. As somebody said recently in a panel, the song is the same, the singer is only different. So I think that's what concerns me. I think Francis has raised the expectations in these last 12 months for many of us. And I think some of these expectations for reform, will probably be achieved. But again, like popes before him, he speaks obliquely about important issues. He doesn't really get specific. I think the one thing he's very specific about is trickle-down economics, and I want to comment on that later. But again, this obliqueness, this vagueness, encourages us to maybe read too much, into what we see. And I read too much into that persona, somebody that's inviting, and compassionate. So he's like a blank slate, that we all want to write our desires upon. But we have to keep in mind, that he said this several times, in all things I am a son of the church. Meaning, again, he operates with the same playbook, really, as Benedict did and the popes before him. After all, he's the pope.
Father Brian is going to talk about contrasting the papacy between Francis and Benedict, but I just wanted to say, many of you might have seen, there was a big article in The Guardian on Saturday, and the title was Pope Francis Revitalizing the Catholic Church. And right before this, you were saying, it's only been a year. How can he do so much? But the way the media writes about this Pope is unlike anything anybody's ever seen. In The Guardian, they say, this is a game-changing papacy. He's a rock star. He's the cool new Pope. And it's not only Catholics who are impressed. The American media has gone crazy over him. So maybe you can talk about, this is very different than
Sure.
Pope Benedict. So.
Thank you, Professor Horowitz. I'm talking about compare and contrast, not just contrast, because so much as you might think there's a lot of things different between both popes, they also have a great degree of commonality. Before I go with that is, I'd like to set the record straight. You mentioned about the media. It was put on Frontline documentary and other people, and it goes on social media, that the Holy Father, Benedict XVI, resigned because of a financial scandal. That is not true. That is a vicious, vile rumor. As I said, Cardinal O'Malley's a friend of mine, Archbishop Gonzalez, and I confirmed, is this really true? He says, no, it's the media makeup stuff. They like to use the term called the papal piñata. Beat up on the papacy any way you can, like a piñata. The matter is, he realized that his own physical, spiritual energy is coming less and less. And unlike Paul, the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, who waited until he died when he was literally incapacitated, Benedict XVI took a spiritual decision, says, it's time for me to resign, let someone else take over. He noticed he did this a couple of days before the season of Lent, who epitomized the sense of sacrifice. And I think he should be commended and appraised for his wonderful, courageous decision to step down. It's the first time in over 600 years that a pope would do that. So there is, I would find great joy, and his sense of sacrifice before Lent of last year is commendatory. Compare and contrast. Benedict, from pre-war Germany, the time where that's where the Reformation happened. Martin Luther, 1517. So that time German Catholics had the identity to be apologists for the faith. So in that matter is, we would apologize for the faith, understanding of faith and morals. That was his background growing up there. He was forced to go into the Hitler Youth against his will. Otherwise, he will be shot on sight. And forever in all his writings, which he was never part of it. Otherwise, he wouldn't be alive. Going through that post-World War II mentality, he realized the United the sentiment needed for change. And we met with John the 23rd. He was one of the theologians going for change at the Second Vatican Council. From a highly intellectual background he came from the idea of a post-war Germany's rebuilding, but it came from Europe. Whereas the Holy Father, Francis, was son of Italian immigrants. I visited his hometown in La Boca in Buenos Aires. That area near the seaport, the Muslims spoke Italian. The Holy Father learned Spanish in grammar school. He was son of immigrants, but he came from a Latin American experience. But eventually we joined the Society of Jesus, and doesn't matter. The time of liberation theology, where they had John Sobrino, a fellow Jesuit, Leonardo Malabaf, one of our Franciscan confreres, Gustavo Gutierrez. When all these complaints about liberation theology, who was one of the people that helped Juan Bergoglio regards to all these distant theologians? It was a archbishop over from Germany named Joseph Ratzinger. Ratzinger did maybe accept liberation theology, but he was empathetic to the needs of that. So they worked together. There's something not commonly known. They worked together to try to ease the tensions of the controversy there. So both came from different continents, and that's why it's the first Latin American pope. But I don't want to use this as a means to try to attack or to demean the importance of Benedict. He had his own different style. But we do appreciate the style of Pope Francis. What of a pope is on the front cover of Rolling Stone magazine? Right? Esquire magazine, the best dressed. I'll never get that title, for God's sakes. But he's been a breath of fresh air. His original term is not to be Francis. His original intent for a name was to be John the 24th, in the spirit of John the 23rd, who opened the doors of the idea of the aggiornamento that matters. Is so much we have this contrast between both. It's important to realize there's a lot of commonality.
So I think when we look at the church vis-a-vis women, the church just doesn't get it, you know. And I think this Pope in particular, as he's sort of forging the road, but I think what Dr. Sparr said, he's still the representative of the church. He's very complimentary, he's very understanding, but you get the sense in some way that women are not seen in the same way that men are when it comes to the church. And even in this latest document, there's really little exception. He talks about women's sensitivity, women's intuition, and other skills which they more than men tend to possess, I'm quoting. And he talks about the special concern which women show to others. He talks about the feminine genius. Women may be socialized to many of these roles and qualities, but we don't have a corner on them. I think there are a lot of men who are sensitive and intuitive and show special concerns for others, and even Francis himself. But there are other qualities of women that Francis doesn't really even mention: intelligence, leadership, political savvy. Those are women's attributes just as much as they're men's attributes as well. I just, I feel like in some ways he's softening down women and sort of putting them in this stereotype that we're trying to fight against. One of the other, he's launched a study of women, which is supposed to come out of Rome, and it's supposed to be something that Rome is supposed to take seriously and do something about. There are three issues in particular that I think we should be on the lookout for in terms of the church's responses to women's issues: maternity, human agency, and poverty. Those are key, and those are where we should be watching when the Church, the Vatican, starts talking about women's issues. How important are the roles and rights of women? We're going to have to look and see about that. When he talks about maternity with women, and he does discuss this at length, maternity occupies at best 20 years of a woman's life. After a while, you live another 30 to 35 to 40 years after your children grow up and move out of the house. So what do you do with it then? Is that the only value that women have in the church? Is that the perpetual definition of what a woman is? What about these insights? What about these gifts? What about these talents? What about, without the input of women, humanity only gets half the picture, really. You only get, half of the mindset. Why in this way does the Pope define women, by their maternity, even when they're not mothers? There are many women who are not mothers. We don't define men by their paternity. We tend to define men by their jobs, by their genius, by their leadership, by their heroic efforts. So that's sort of a concern I have right now. He noted in one of his recent interviews that we have to develop a profound theology of the woman, and that's going to help work in making their function in the church better. My question is, who's going to be doing that study? Are women going to be doing that study, or are men going to be doing that study?
Anyway, lightning striking the dome of St. Peter's was kind of a message, I guess, that some conservatives thought, God was sending us. But anyway, I just want to revisit some of the things that Father Brian mentioned. I think style and tone, again, are important, again, in contrasting Benedict and Francis. And one of the problems was that Benedict, a good man, a very learned man, a scholar, and that might have been his problem. He came across as kind of cold, and remote. He didn't have the charm that John Paul had, and he doesn't have the charm, again, that the current Pope has. Plus, again, it's not always very popular to be a staunch conservative. And in some ways, again, like John Paul, he thought that the Vatican Council had gone a little bit too far. And he wanted to kind of roll back the excesses, especially this notion of the spirit of the council as opposed to the documents. So again, his role, and again, he was called God's Rottweiler when he was the prefect of the Congregation of the Faith, which was the enforcer, again, of Vatican doctrine under John Paul. He was going to reimpose the authority of the church. And again, that's kind of what's called fortress Catholicism. Again, it's not very inviting. It's kind of like circling the wagons. So as Pope, again, one of the things he did, which is still lasting, is that I'm talking about Benedict now, he appointed a lot of conservative bishops. Now again, Francis is trying to winnow some of these people away, but this is a very important part of the hierarchy, and they have a lot to do, again, with policy. So again, another thing that Benedict did was he took a very hard line on contraception, women's role in the church, although again, Francis hasn't changed much with women's role, I don't think. And again, he's always been seen as attacking this culture of relativism, and it's sort of like the church against modern society. Again, his tone was kind of legalistic. He always thought that maybe the church would be better if it was smaller, because then it would be a purer church. Much different, again, with this new evangelization, again, that's associated with Francis. Plus, again, he wasn't forced out of the Vatican because of what you had said about, what was it? The
Frontline doctor said that he was forced up because of financial
scandal. Although you'd have to say that the Vatican Bank was a scandal. But
That has been for 20 years.
Right, okay, so that's true. So again, he was seen as kind of a poor manager, a poor administrator. So Francis comes along, and again, he's the reformer. And by the way, Francis was actually the runner-up, in 2005 when Benedict was elected. So again, he comes with a different tone. He's a master of the media. I think the emphasis, again, most important is emphasis is different. Again, Benedict was doctrinal purity. Francis, again, his vision is much more pastoral. He's the Holy Father. Again, somebody, again, that we can relate to. His theme, his signature theme is mercy. How many of us, need that? I think all of us need that. And he himself has said that. So again, I think Benedict was, the church of the true believer. I think that Francis is the church of the Beatitudes. I think he reminds us that we are a Christian church and that we should act as Christians.
I concur with Professor Sparr. There are different ways we interpret the Second Vatican Council, which I think was the greatest that happened in contemporary centuries on that. One thing that my colleague, Professor Sparr, reminded me is Pope Francis is the only pope who was not a member of the Vatican II. He was not present there. He was not a participant in the Vatican II as John Paul II was, Benedict himself. So because of that, I see that as a unique advantage for him not being there. He wasn't involved in all the biases or the politics and all the other menagerie that was going around there. He was completely objective from his viewpoint, especially being a member of a religious order. So the Vatican II is still continuing on. I believe Pope Francis continued the importance of the vision of Pope John the 23rd. And I'm delighted that both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis will canonize all popes on April 27th, I believe. In that sense, that's what I have to say about Vatican II. The Pope has two purposes. It could be the lighthouse, be the light of truth amidst the darkness of ignorance. He could also be a lightning rod. When you attack capitalism, you're going to be praised by many liberals like that, but many conservatives and many other folks who have a lot of money involved, they're not too happy with Pope Francis right now. And understandably so. I'm going to say rightly so. My language is understandably so. They're threatened by this man because he has a lot of influence on what he says and does. Professor Dilly and I spoke beforehand the idea of climate change. Climate change is also, is dictated by our own economic policies and capitalism throughout the world, and different structures. In this sense, the Holy Father is going towards South Korea on August 14th to 18th. The initial reason is because of Asian Youth Day. That's true. But he's also going over there because there's a six-nation matter going in regards to South Korea and North Korea. There is tremendous poverty and suffering and violence going on in North Korea as we speak. The people are starving every day. They're giving all the monies towards the army and the nuclear arms and stuff like that. So it's such a, talk about income inequality like that. It's going on in North Korea. I believe whether the North Koreans can admit or not, they're going to be threatened by the presence of Pope Francis being there in the South. And also Japan and Russia and China are also going to feel those effects. He is a lightning rod. He is challenging those who have the very rich don't want to share, and calling me is we have to stop this unequal distribution of wealth and share it with the poor.
I'll be honest with you, I don't know where his agenda is going specifically in terms of addressing social justice issues, other than we know he's started to do that just by the very lifestyle that he's chosen to lead. I think it's been referred, he's moved out of the papal apartments, he lives in very humble, sort of a couple of rooms in the Vatican, got rid of his red shoes. I don't know.
Thank God.
I don't know, I was a little, I had a moment of silence about that. He lives in a communal setting. He is urging people those in the curia and the hierarchy to sort of tone down their lifestyles, tone down the cars that they drive, the trips that they take. He's very much focused on the conditions of slums in the world, particularly in South America, where he comes from. He does, as Father Brian say, he's coming up against some resistance, because that small majority of the world who owns most of the wealth is pushing up against him, and they're throwing phrases around like Marxist and things like that, which are really not true at all. But it's this idea of social justice for the Pope is what the Church needs to begin with, what the Church needs to continue to do, and what the Church needs to end with. So he is, appointing different cardinals and different consultants who are going to assist him in sort of governing the Church towards this vision, a Church, that he wants to see as a church of the poor, for the poor. So how that's actually going to be implemented, I think it remains to be seen, but I know that's really where his focus tends to be.
In a short answer to that question, what can Francis actually do to address inequality? The short answer is very little, actually. I mean, after all, he's the Pope. He doesn't make public policy. But I think it's very interesting how his critique of this trickle-down economics has already impacted the public policy debates in this country. I think there's real potential here. This Evangelii Gaudium, which is the joy of the gospel, where he was very harsh against laissez-faire capitalism, which has been said before. But at the very moment he's delivering this, in Washington, they're debating the budget, they're debating defense, they're debating welfare cuts, and income inequality right now. That's a very hot topic right now in this country, and also in this city, of course, with Mayor de Blasio. So no wonder then that liberal Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who's actually a socialist, the only one in Congress, exclaimed in a recent debate about the budget that we have a strong ally on this side on the issue, and that is the Pope. No wonder President Obama approvingly quoted, from The Joy of the Gospel, and again this critique of the free market, when he talked about the need for a higher minimum wage. Or when Democratic House Leader Nancy Pelosi exclaimed, the Pope sounds more and more every day like the nuns on the bus, again, who were very, very upfront, again, about social justice, again, for the poor. On the other side, again, no wonder that Rush Limbaugh, who was, very, very powerful as a talk radio host, denounced Francis as a socialist and called his economics pure Marxism. Or Fox News lamented, and this is the worst thing I guess you can do nowadays, is compare somebody to Obama. So he says, Pope Francis is the Catholic Church's Obama. God help us, they said. So again, I said other popes have mentioned social justice issues quite strongly. It began in 1891 with the social encyclicals, Rerum Novarum in 1891 with Leo. I talked about this actually last year when they were talking about the rights of labor, which was happening in Wisconsin when the governor of Wisconsin was taking away the right to unionize. And some Catholic bishops in Wisconsin said, no, you're going against Catholic social policy. Again, and he was going against Rerum Novarum, again, which called for the right for trade unions. And this was back in 1891. Or asserting the right of workers to a living wage. That's Rerum Novarum. But to my knowledge, no pope in modern times has so specifically addressed actual economic policy. As I said before, popes tend to speak very obliquely. But trickle-down economics is an identifiably conservative economic theory that began under Republican President Ronald Reagan with what was called supply-side economics. And the theory is, again, if you cut taxes for the wealthy, you will create jobs. You will, you'll get them to invest more, and again, there will be more economic output. The same principle was behind George W. Bush in 2001 with his 2001 tax cuts, which again only increased the deficit as far as I see. So I think Francis is correct when he claims, quote, this theory has never been confirmed by the facts. Fact, 38% of the Bush tax cuts went to the wealthy. Fact, between 2009 and 2012, 95% of income gains in the country went to the top 1%. So again, what can Francis do? Well, I think what he's doing is he's reminding us in conscience. He's saying, again, there's sin which is personal, but there's also sin that is social. And again, part of that, again, is ignoring the needs, again, of people that are in need. That trickle-down economics does not do that, as far as the facts show anyway. So I think his purpose is moral. Again, I think he's saying that poverty isn't simply charity, it's all about justice. I think that's something that needs to be said. I think another thing that's kind of interesting is that there's a lot of fallout from Francis's pronouncements. Again, as Father Brian mentioned, that he's making a lot of conservatives nervous because in the past, because the church was so strong, again, about the hot button issues about contraception, for example, birth control, abortion, gay rights. It was so strong. They were always seen as an ally, you see, of the Republican Party. The bishops were seen as spokespeople for, certain Republican policies, family value policies, see. But again, I think what Pope Francis is doing, he's trying to put a new balance there. He's saying, yes, we have to talk about things that are very important in the church, but again, we have to again change the tune a little bit and get into this notion of social justice.
The bishops of the faithful, they shall manifest a universal consent in matters of faith and morals. Matters the idea of regards to ordination of women to the priesthood is not even on the table in the Vatican. However, with the inclusion of the permanent diaconate in 1976, the possibility of a married clergy down the line is on this. The Vatican has, put it this way, the church has lasted for 2,000 years. Why? It changed very, very slowly. Change is slow. The inclusion of having the permanent in 1976 and then the anticipation of a married clergy, it's going to take many, many years down the line. I am not answering your question the way you want to. I should say it. I'm not dodging it as well. But I can safely say in the Vatican, it's not even on the table. However, looking on another matter, number 3, the collegiality of local conference of bishops. They have a responsibility to look at the universal aspect of the church, but the Vatican says, but you also have to look But the Vatican II time, the signs of the times, what's going on in their local church, in their country, in their conference. They have to look at that reality. And by the way, 85% of those who work in parish United States are women. Women are running the parishes.
I think what Father Brian said is absolutely correct. What I might add is maybe not in our lifetime, but I think it's going to happen. There are already women who are ordained Roman Catholic clergy women. It's underground. It's not recognized by the Vatican, but there is a movement, and I think I think what's going to happen, and you might disagree with me, Father Brian. I think married men clergy is going to happen, and then at some point, again, maybe in our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren's lifetime. But because, as Father Brian pointed out, the change in the church is very slow. But don't forget, in that early first century church, women were running the churches.
I want to go back to the argument you made, why not women? And the counter argument always is that, Christ was a male. And, somehow you image Jesus, again, by being a male priest. But again, if you're a follower of Christ, you image his humanity. So gender really has absolutely nothing to do with that. The other thing is there's really no theological obstacle to this. It's not a matter of doctrine. It's been a matter of practice, you see. So it can be done. I agree it probably won't be done, but
Not my life.
who knows? He did say again he wants to give women more of a presence in the church, more leadership roles. But the problem with that, almost every leadership position in the church is tied to ordination, see? So he would have to create a new office, really.
No. Women can be chancellors of dioceses. Women can be canon lawyers in that way. And chancellors have a lot of power in the diocese, believe me. I've worked with one, Jane Belford, down in the Archdiocese of Washington. I was a pastor there. So I am not trying to be protective or defensive about that. We do have to better role of women in the church. But there are roles women can take without the benefit of the ordination. I wouldn't say it's the rules of the church. I would say that the culture. The Irish, are very influenced by the French Jansenists, and to influence a lot of other different hang-ups. So that's another forum for itself. So not only when I go back to the collegiality of the local conference bishops, you're also respecting the cultural traditions, the mores of that particular country. That's what we call by collegiality, which needs to be more fostered. And I hope the Holy Father talks about all the cardinals and bishops in the future is how can we give a little more understanding, empower the bishops to be more pastorally sensitive to the needs of the local church. And I believe that's where you're going to, and I hope I'm not changing the question as you intended, but I'm probably building on towards that. Every country has their own tradition, their language, and mores like that, and each local bishop has to be responsive to that. At the same time, like a call to the universal call of the church. We're all universal. At the same time, remember the thing from Tip O'Neill, think globally but act locally. I'm using like an oversimplification of that, but I agree. Every country has their matters like that. But the thing is, you look at the signs of the times. The Vatican II statement. What is the signs of the time? What is the reality of the local church, and where is Christ there? Every diocese in the country, that has a Latin Mass. So if you want to go to Latin Mass, in fact, right now they have Our Lady of Peace at 9:30 every Sunday. When I go to Latin Mass, to me, it's old church. Let it go. That's part of the past. We should move on. I think we should speak Spanish. We should speak French, Chinese, and matters like that. I'm not denigrating the Latin Mass. It had its time and purpose, but it does not translate well to the 21st century needs.
Okay,
But we do have a Latin Mass.
Thank you so much. So,
First of all, I think any pope that's elected should be the best qualified person for the job, not just. Now, I understand what you're saying. But I think that's the most important thing to be thinking of. Having said that, I'll build on it and say, where are the majority of the Catholics coming from? So that's an important factor as well. Do I think his background is influencing his papacy and his agenda? Was that your question?
Right, experience in Latin America.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. There's no question about that. Look at, out of the gate what he's doing in terms of making the poor and the marginalized, his priority. He goes to Buenos Aires for World Youth Day. Where does he go to visit? Where is his stop that he makes? In those slums. He spends his time there. So, he's in that sense, and I think it's his personality, because I think, as Dr. Sparr alluded to, Benedict is a very cerebral, shy man, just not his style, whereas this Pope Francis, his style is to be amongst the people. He's a security nightmare. But I think that's because of his, sort of boots to the ground experience in Latin America. It will hopefully set the tone for future papacies to continue with this as a priority. That's my sense of it. I don't know if that really answers, but maybe Dr. Sparr.
Yeah, I would say absolutely also, David. He's the first pope from the Southern Hemisphere, right? The first non-European pope for centuries. And again, it's very interesting, his experience in Latin America, and it's been written about. I would recommend a book called Untying the Knots by a guy named Paul Vallely, Untying the Knots. And it talks about his experience in Latin America from the time when he was just a cleric, when he was a beginning Jesuit, until the time, again, when he was Archbishop of Rio de Janeiro. And it was a very eye-opening experience. Initially, he was accused of being indifferent to what was called the Dirty War in Argentina, which has something to do with the dictatorship that was there. Juan Perón and the fascists, and absolutely stamping out dissent. Again, there were two Jesuits that he was supervising, actually, because he was the provincial of the Jesuit order, when he was only like 36 years old, very, very young man, and he admits that it was beyond him. But these Jesuits were actually going to the slums and working with the poor, and the dictators didn't like that, thought that they were, radicals. So he actually told them they would have to leave, and they didn't. And when he did, he withdrew their permission, again, to serve in the diocese. And they claim, at first both of them did, that was permission for the dictatorship to kidnap them, bring them into prison, and torture them. And that happened. Also, as Father Brian mentioned, during this dirty war, he was actually secreting people away. He gave somebody his identification papers to leave the country. So it was kind of a mixed review, but again, it had a very searing experience on Francis himself. And again, Vallely mentions this whole theme of mercy and what he said when he was first accepted the papacy. I am a sinner. According to Vallely and others that look at him, he's looking at his experience in what happened in Latin America, where he was indifferent to liberation theology, where he told the priests they couldn't work in the slums. Well, after he saw the light, he became known as the slum priest. He was going to the slums again after he had this awakening, after the knots were untied. And of course he's carried that through, of course, in his papacy himself. So I hope that answers your question. Very important that he's from there.
I got a twofold response, and I'm not being defensive in the response, but I'm just telling the truth, and I could give you a local rationale for it. Clergy abuse by any faith tradition, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Islam, is an offense to God. And anyone who does that should be punished. At the same time, if they need psychological treatment, they should get that as well. There is a commission on that, and Sean Cardinal O'Malley, who's been a tireless advocate for those who've been abused throughout the years. My friend Sean has been in the toughest assignments in any diocese throughout the country. And he's one of the advisors of 8 instructing the Holy Father how to deal regards to priests who abuse children. And that's going to be looked at in that matter. I was on my province's section misconduct review board years ago. I went down to a seminar on the Center of Sexual Disorders at Johns Hopkins University, with a leading psychiatrist, Dr. Frederick Berlin. He said in class, this is not a Catholic problem. This is around the border of any culture, any language, any religion. And 85% of those abused children come from members of their own families. So yes, this is an issue in the Catholic Church. It's vexing. It's in the media all the time. But right here in the local DA's office, they are prosecuting cases of child abuse of members of other religious traditions other than Roman Catholic at the present time. At the same time, there's not one priest, not one religious sister, one brother or deacon who's being prosecuted by the Brooklyn DA's office in regards to child abuse. It's a serious issue. Again, I'm not trying to be defensive about it. This is a societal issue, not just a Catholic issue, but they should be punished.
Well, right now the church has a policy of zero tolerance right now for any cleric associated with the church, that they can no longer, hold that office. The other thing that they hadn't been doing, and again, Benedict started the zero tolerance actually. He also started the idea that now you have to report these abuses to the authorities. Before that, it was very much of a private matter. I think some things could be done much more, and again, I think that Benedict, we're waiting, it's a very complicated issue, but there has been a panel, that's been appointed. But right now, there's really no members of that panel yet that I'm aware of. It's supposed to meet, but again, no date has been set. And the other criticism is there still are bishops again that had actually hid, moved priests around, and again, they were still predators while they were being moved around. Now, one priest who was a bishop actually in Kansas. His name is Bishop Finn. Was actually prosecuted, the first bishop that was actually prosecuted by law for a misdemeanor, for not reining in, a priest again that he had reappointed, to different parishes. So he was sentenced to 2 years probation. So he's still free, but he's still bishop, you see, of Kansas City. And again, that's one of the criticisms, again, that you're going to hear, when they talk about, well, what is Francis really doing, again, about sexual abuses? This Who Am I, we got a lot of press, of course, and it was related to somebody asked him, I think, on a flight coming back from Brazil, about homosexuals within the priesthood, actually. And he said, who am I to judge? Some people see this as, major change, in the church's attitude toward homosexuality, same-sex marriage. I do not see those remarks as an abandonment of Catholic moral teaching, as some people do. Rather, again, I see it as a change in tone. It's so important, again, with Francis. And again, I would just go back to what you said. Again, he deals a lot with gestures, I know. And one thing that he hasn't done, and I wish he'd do, I would like him to meet with victims of sexual abuse. Now, Benedict did that, but I think that would go a long way, in talking about this emphasis that is very important as part of his persona. So again, I think, again, if you couple that with, again, what he said on that plane with the remarks that he made in America Magazine, which was early in his papacy, I think it serves another example of his change in emphasis, see. When Francis said the church did not have to talk about gay marriage, contraception, and abortion all the time, we can't be obsessed with that. That was the word, again, that he used. So I think, what he's saying is we should ease up on the culture wars a little bit and, again, have a new balance of other important aspects of Catholic thought, which is Catholic social thought, which, of course, this class is doing right now.
Building on what Dr. Sparr said, which he said very well, is I think when he made that comment, it was a gesture of openness. And I think, again, it was his desire to enter into this cultural conversation that's happening. A lot of the focus when he made that statement was he was speaking about a gay man. I think he was actually talking about a gay Monsignor, if I'm not mistaken. But I think what he was really trying to say when he made that statement was something about what he thinks it means to be a Christian. Especially someone who's a Christian leader. It's not for us to judge. God has that job. What it is for Christians to do, and what Francis was trying to say is, we need to be there for people. We need to walk alongside other people and just trust in God's mercy and trust in the mercy of one another. You know, and he really sort of, again, what he's saying is not new. Pope Benedict defended the dignity of all people, including homosexuals. We won't get into the whole intrinsic act. You know, if you'd gone to Dr. Harrell's lecture, you would have gotten a whole mouthful of Catholic theology on that, which was good. You know, because I think it's also important that people do understand exactly what the church's teaching is in order to enter into conversation with that teaching. He hasn't altered the possibility of gay marriage, you know, but again, as Dr. Sparr said, his tone is very different. And, you know, he did sort of say, when somebody asked him about approving of homosexuality, he replied and said, "Tell me, when God looks at a gay person, does he endorse the existence of this person with love or reject and condemn this person?" And I think that sort of, in essence, you know, what Francis is saying. Look at the person, you know, leave the judgments to God.
I echo what Alexandria just said about the person. The primary teaching of Catholic social thought, the primary one, is the dignity of the human person. Everyone counts. Everyone counts as a person. Case in point, look what Pope Francis did on Holy Thursday night. He went to a prison for youthful offenders. He kissed the feet of 12 people, one of them a young Muslim woman. Never, ever in the history of the papacy has ever happened. He kissed the foot of a Muslim woman offender. I'll call that radical, if you want to hear something radical. And I'll also call it loving. Everyone counts in this matter there's 1 year, but there's a lot of hope. Remember, change takes a lot of time. He epitomizes the new evangelization. Thank you very much, and God bless you.